Hello, welcome to yet another episode of Nkata podcast. In this podcast, as some of you know, if you have been following the project, this is a place where I discuss concepts, ideas, tease out thoughts, most of them inspired by encounters, but also thoughts that arrive or have eventually found a clear articulation or is on the way towards a clear articulation. So, yeah, that's what this podcast space is about. And if you are encountering this podcast for the first time, you're welcome. Today's episode is based on a thought that I've been fleshing out, I would say, for the past over a year now. But as with every thought that eventually makes it into the podcast as an episode, there are usually moments when the concept become very potent, I would say. It's as if there's a need for it to actually come out in a form, say as a writing, a podcast conversation like this one, or any other form. And usually what happens is that there seems to be a dwelling on it. Yeah. So it could be within 2 days or even 2 weeks. But the thing is this, that when this happens, everything that I do, there seem to be like an analogy for this very concept. That is to say, it sort of like occupies or invades my reality at the time because it is asking to be articulated. So that's what's been happening for the past, I would say, 1 week around the thought that we're going to be discussing today. And so this morning I woke up and right from my bed, I picked up my phone and I decided to write this into an essay. And I call it a meditation on light. Okay. I wrote it this morning and then I eventually came to the desk to fine tune it. And as I was doing that, I said to myself, why not I make this into an episode? And so here we are. But what I want to do today is something, again, I haven't done in the other episodes, which is the whole point of this podcast, because for me, it's also a way of being more organic and more fluid as to the process of getting to give these concepts and these philosophical musings a form. So I haven't done this before, so it's the first time. So I have in front of me, open on a laptop, the writing that I've done this morning. And so what I want to do is to read it out and also add some reflection to it wherever is necessary. And so that's going to be basically today's episode. All right, let's get right into it. A meditation on light. The physicist has said that light has no mass. It has no weight. So let us use this analogy. Light is massless. Light is weightless. Yet, it is exquisitely sensitive to form. It fights nothing. It absents nothing. Yet, it is indomitable. What is its indomitability? Is it one of force and imposition? But light has no mass, no weight. So, it does not force. It does not impose. And because it has no weight and no gravity, it creates no hierarchy by its nature. It is one and all things. So basically, I have said that light is massless and has no weight. We have a visitor. But at the same time, it is exquisitely sensitive to form. Now look around us, the way light is on objects, on things, in our everyday cognitive reality. Look at how light works. Light is constantly sculpting and giving us a sense of form in space. It is what allows us to differentiate, or it is in and of itself differentiation. And of course, working with the organ of sight called eyes, right? But also with our brain and all of that. You get the drift. So that is what I was referring to as light being exquisitely sensitive to form. And it's also indomitable. And what is this indomitability? It is that it is weightless. It does not impose. It does not force. That is actually why it is indomitable. Isn't that interesting? It's been said that light travels and moves, but light itself is immovable until it is measured. So movement itself is measurement. The immeasurable is also the immovable. And this is one that merits its own meditation and reflection altogether as a whole other, as a standalone reflection to go into, which is that movement is in and of itself measurement. When there is no measurement, there is no movement. And so the immeasurable is the immovable as well. Light's relationship with all things is one of illumination. It does not contest or judge the nature of a thing, for it is light which articulates the nature of a thing by delineating its contours. So, light illuminates, but it does not contest or judge. Remember, we've already said that it is one and all things, and it does not have mass or weight or gravity. So, it does not contest. It does not impose any hierarchy. It does not create by its nature hierarchy, because for hierarchy to be, there has to be things of comparable weightness, or there has to be things with gravity and weight for which you can compare with something else of less or more gravity and weight. But light has no weight, it has no mass, it has no gravity. So it does not impose. Its relationship is one of illumination. It does not contest. It does not judge a thing, right? So when a human being says, I stand in the light, what does this imply? The human being is like a tree, rooted, yet also branching. Like plants, they too respond to the stimulus of light. Thus, their action becomes a reflection of how they stand in light. The quality of the action is evidence of one's nature as a specific collation of human intelligence. The human being does not shape light. The human being is a measure and orientation of light. When a human being says, I stand in the light, bearing in mind that the human being is an object with weight, with mass, with gravity, and the constant continuation of piling up on that mass, on that weight, on that gravity. So, the very concept of a human being the human being does not shape light, does not decide how light moves or not move. So, the human being becomes this collation of human intelligence that orients light through its own action. And one's action is, in and of itself, a measure of the quality of the movement of light and how the human being, the human intelligence, orients light. The human being is a measure and orientation of light. The human being is a fractal of that intelligence that creates form. Light consecrates it and bears witness to form. So the human being is a fractal. And then fractal is something to understand properly, because fractal is not just a duplication or a copy of one thing into many things. It is that generative pattern in form, right? So a human being is a fractal of that intelligence that creates form. And light consecrates it and bears witness to the form. This witnessing of the light on form, that touches form, that gives form its contours, that delineates the threshold for which something is different from the other, is life-bearing, because it is the longest running thread across all forms. So we have already established through physics that light travels through a vacuum, right? So the reach of light, it permeates all forms. And this idea of consecration, right, or the witnessing, is something that light does across all forms. Therefore, that in and of itself is life bearing, because there is a certain sense of ordering, a certain sense of cosmic order that permeates all form. And that in and of itself is life bearing. I want to keep it there because what I'm discussing here is quite is much deeper than words can at this moment really clarify. But let's just leave it at that. Okay? Shadow is light under obstruction. This obstruction is the revelation of the very nature of relation. This obstruction is a rebound effect of polarization. So now I enter the realm of shadow because we often talk about shadow as opposite to light. What I'm proposing here is that shadow is light under obstruction because we've already established that light delineates the threshold and the contours. But as we go further now, we understand that shadow is what happens, or shadow is the evidence of something being in relationship to the weightlessness of light. That is why I'm also talking about polarization here. And where there is movement, there is bound to be polarity and a threshold delineated by a boundary. So when there's polarization or when there is movement, because that movement we have already established is measurement, and that measurement is always a component of creation. That is to give form to things. Okay? And so where there is movement, there is bound to be polarity because movement leads to creation, right? Leads to measurement. But when all of that happens, polarity must ensue. And where there is polarity, a threshold delineated by a boundary is also implied. Now, fear, our usual, fear that we know, we can talk about fear on different levels, but here we are talking about that psychological fear. Fear arises by the attempt to absent the shadow from all that is reality. Now, distortion comes into being as a result of that. Until now, polarization, movement, measurement, creation of forms is all within the realm of reality, of the coherence of reality, let's put it that way. But then fear comes in. Fear is to remove the shadow, to absent the shadow from all that is reality. Of course, to say what is good and what is bad. Morality is based on that. Good has an upper, higher value, let's put it that way, value in relation to bad, right and wrong. And then we human beings, we also divide ourselves into the good guy and the bad guy. Remember that I'm speaking about this outside of polarity, which is very much a component or a movement within the coherence of creation, polarity. But then there is morality, which is the good is better than the bad. Of course, obviously, this is hierarchy coming into the whole equation. But before we even begin to talk about that, so you see that the distortion has already entered. The moment there is an effort to absent shadow, to remove shadow, therefore making something that is good better than the bad, giving it a hierarchical position over what is bad. That is to say, to judge it, to condemn it, to say this is positive and this is negative, and the positive is better. That is in and of itself hierarchy. That is actually what brings about fear. It's not the understanding of shadow, because light forces nothing, it absents nothing. Yet in light, all is revealed. That is its indomitability. Now, this is so interesting to understand. First of all, the whole premise of this reflection, of this meditation, is that light is massless. Light has no weight. It forces nothing. It absents nothing. Yet in light, all is revealed. All is revealed at the right time, just like truth. Truth cannot hide. It only reveals itself when the conditions are right and in the right timing, but it never hides. No one can succeed in hiding the truth. It always reveals itself in the right condition. And that is also its indomitability. But truth is very much intrinsically connected to light, right? Truth and light, same movement, okay? To stand in light is to stand weightless, massless. Otherwise, one is presented with the object-like gravitational nature directly proportional to the shadow they cast. So what brings about shadow is the weight, the gravity, the mass, always standing in relationship with the weightlessness and the masslessness of light. That is what brings about the shadow. It is important to understand what shadow is as opposed to rushing to eliminate it. Because without understanding what the shadow is, it cannot be transformed, it cannot be incorporated, it cannot be integrated. Because shadow is not opposite of light. Light has no opposite. Light has no opposite. Nothing can come into consciousness as the opposite of light. This might be a controversial statement to make, but yeah, join me in the reflection, join me in the meditation, or rather, go with it and see how this sits with you, how this resonates with you. Okay? Light has no opposite. Nothing can come into the consciousness of being the opposite of light. That is also because light, in its nature, does not create hierarchy. Because there is nothing about its nature. There is no location or an anchor point in its masslessness, in its weightlessness, that one can pin for mass and gravity and for hierarchy to even ensue. And so nothing can come up consciously as its opposite. Nothing can come up consciously as the opposite of light. And the same is for truth. So the opposite of truth is not lies. That in and of itself is a whole other distortion going on. But truth also has no opposite. And this question of things and its opposite is a reflection I will get into perhaps in subsequent episodes as well, because this is something that I have been fleshing out along the lines as well. This question of things having opposite, like abundance, lack, or deficiency is not the opposite of abundance. Abundance has no opposite. The true meaning of abundance, it does not have opposite. It's an ever sprawling field, endless abundance. But this is a story for another day. It is beside the point to argue for what is light and what is shadow, as if they are opposites of each other. And I know that in most spiritual and religious knowledge, light and shadow is placed as opposites, even the yin and yang. But it is important to understand that shadow is that which has mass. By whatever means it has gathered mass and weight and gravity, standing beside and in relation to the weightlessness and the masslessness of light. This is the core of this entire meditation today. To argue what is light and what is shadow as if they are opposite is, in and of itself, an attempt at a redundant hierarchy in the way we have established what hierarchy means so far in this meditation. Shadow is the gravity of anything that stands in relation to the weightlessness of light. This is it. Shadow is the gravity of anything that stands in relation to the weightlessness of light. In other words, the shadow is a natural consequence of things having mass and weight and all the accumulations around it in relation or standing in relation to the weightlessness of light. So when a human being says, I stand in the light, obviously, the human being who is aware of what light is, when he or she says, I stand in the light, will immediately also see for themselves the shadow. But they will also see why that shadow is there. And they will see that it is not the opposite of light, but rather the evidence of that relation, of that which stands with all its weight, all its mass in relation to light. Light that does not force, that does not impose, that does not seek to absent shadow, that does not seek to eliminate. And I know that in our spiritual books, in our spiritual knowledge, we've been told that light fights to eradicate shadow, to conquer it, to all of that, to dominate. I know. Yet I'm saying all of this. So take it as you wish. If it resonates with you, great. If you don't, please leave it alone. This whole reflection is simply what it is. It's not seeking to prove anything. There is nothing that I'm doing right now in which I am seeking to prove anything, but rather to express inklings and also to enter that process of articulation from formlessness to form. Okay? So shadow cannot be eliminated. That which implies shadow or that which is shadow must be massless, weightless, for shadow to be integrated. Okay? So you see that it is not, that integration doesn't come by condemning, by eliminating shadow. It cannot be eliminated. But at some point, it becomes massless, weightless, for that shadow now to be integrated. That which is shadow, which has weight, which has mass, has to become massless, weightless, for it to be integrated. That is where I'm going with all of this. You cannot simply eliminate shadow, for which now light remains. One cannot say, well, since shadow is the opposite of light, let me eliminate the shadow and then stay with the light. That which is shadow must become massless, weightless, for it to be integrated into the light, for it to integrate into the light. Now the question is, how does that movement happen? How does that which has weight, which has mass, how does it become weightless and massless for it to now to be integrated in light? For if it doesn't become that, it will continue to be shadow. But shadow is not the opposite of light. Light has no opposite. This is the last line in the reflection now. And let me bring it all together. That which implies shadow must be massless, weightless, for shadow to be integrated. Until then, let light be the witness, as one stands humbly, without conceit and judgment in it. So until the shadow becomes massless and weightless and integrated into light, let light be the witness, as one stands humbly, without conceit and judgment in light. For that standing in light, humbly, without conceit, without judgment, is what allows one to be completely aware of shadow. Shadow that is a function of the weight, the gravity, the mass, standing in relation to the weightlessness of light. Until that shadow is integrated, that is, until it is consecrated and becomes massless, weightless. I think this is what sometimes people want to talk about when they say to let go, to forgive, to just let all the weight fall away. Until that shadow becomes massless, weightless, unburdened, it cannot integrate into the light. Okay? But until then, because again, this is not something that has to be forced. You cannot force it. Until then, let light be the witness, because that is what it does. Let light be the witness. As one stands in all your flaws, in all your inadequacies and all of that, because naturally the human being has weight, has mass, and everything around us encourages us to continue to pile on that weight and mass and gravity. Take, for instance, all of the prescriptions and all of the store of value that we heap around ourselves, for which we are this or that, or more important than this person or that person, for which we prefer this over this. All of that is a function of piling up gravity, weight, and mass. And we know it that in relationships, where there is power play or, comparisons, it's always based on gravity, on gravitas. Who has more than the other? Who is more this than the other? No matter where we turn. Oh, look at that person who is such a wonderful person. Oh, that person is more wonderful than the other person. Okay. Oh, look at this person who is so beautiful. Oh, he is more beautiful than the other. Oh, look at this person who is wealthy. Oh, she is wealthier than the other. All of that is based on weight and mass. Because for something to be more or less than the other, it implies naturally weight. Because if it is weightless and massless, there is nothing to compare. There is absolutely nothing to compare the other with the other. Okay? So there is a constant returning to letting go, to forgive, detachment or non-attachment. The scriptures, in many of the scriptures, they bring you back to this. But it is that return to the masslessness of light, to the weightlessness of light. That is the transformation that shadow undergoes for it to be integrated into light in the way that light is. Until then, it will itself be the evidence. That shadow will be the evidence of that which has weight, that which is object-like, that which has form, and therefore limitation. Okay? So that is what today's episode is about.